Hello, this is Coach Wilson, and this is Unit 8, Day 4. Today we're going to be discussing a little more about the Progressive Era, and your journal today is going to be on what were some activities that you may have taken part of in the early 1900s. All right, so we talked about sports and racism in Day 3, and I want you to recoup and recall some of those things that you could have been doing as an individual with your free time and new leisure time in the 1900s. And then also I'd like for you to talk about what were some issues for African Americans during the Progressive Era. All right, we know that a lot is going on with the African American community during this time of change in our country, but we want to talk specifically about 1890 to about 1910 and kind of the things that we spoke about yesterday. They don't have to be negative things, they can be positive things as well. Today we're going to be talking about the woman question. And we're going to be talking about what is going on with our ladies and how society's influencing them with reforms and various things. And we're going to kind of go a little bit further into this unit than I like to go. I normally don't like to do this part until we get done with a little more history. But we're going to go ahead and cover women's suffrage today. That way that we don't have to do it in a separate note away from this information. Now, our essential question for the day are what influences changed the roles and activities of women during the early 1900s? Okay, and we come to this question that is in society right now, or at least during this time. What is a woman supposed to do? What is her role? And this is the woman question, okay? Should they get the right to vote? Should they get equal pay for equal work? Should they have equal access to property? Equal access to education? And then obviously, I think we all agree, everyone should be free from domestic violence, okay? And at this time, there wasn't a lot of protection for women, okay, from their husbands, from society. Women are honestly kind of trampled on in American society at this point. And so women are working in a lot of sectors of the economy, but unpaid housework is still very essential into what the family needs and expects, taking care of the kids, etc. But what's happening is now, things that took all day to do aren't taking all day to do because new technologies have formed, like running water, washing machines, and they're decreasing the time it takes for women and families to complete household work that before was taking much, much longer. And because of this, women are able to pursue advanced education opportunities. They also take leading roles in reforms and labor relations and just various things in the community that women never were able to do prior to the early 1900s. Now, housework is still very tough, though. It's not like it just got super easy. By 1917, there's still only about a quarter of Americans that actually have electricity and somewhat of what you would call technology. Now, because of this, women still were going into factories and working in various places, but women aren't really getting a lot of opportunity. We talked about that in Unit 7. They were rarely given supervisory roles even into the 1900s and paid about 30 to 60% less than men. And there was this stereotype that was produced by many people, specifically those in education, that women didn't have the mental capacity for professional training or for what you would call leadership. And even Harvard professors, I think one guy his name was Edward Clark, where he published an article saying women didn't have the capacity to be doctors and things of that nature, even though at this point in time in history there were already female doctors and lawyers and everything else. So a lot of misguided and unproven statements going on during this time. Now, the Civil War had increased a lot of women's involvement in volunteer work, and that's going to lead to new organizations forming, such as the New England Women's Club. They supported temperance and education, and you're going to continue to see temperance tied to women's virtue and women's suffrage. And what's going to happen is that these women are going to begin to form these volunteer organizations into bigger national associations and try to support their rights. So you have the Association for the Advancement of Women, and then you have the General Federation of Women's Club. But all these smaller associations by 1890 are going to eventually come together, and they're going to form the National American Women's Suffrage Association. I'll call it NALSA, but NALSA basically is all of these groups combined, and they're going to fight for women's right to vote. And just to make sure we're clear, when we're talking about suffrage, suffrage is the right to vote. Women's suffrage means women's right to vote. NALSA won't achieve their victory until 30 years later, but because of their society and what they start pushing and all the things going on in our country with sports and all the various other factors, women are beginning to change. They're wearing different clothing, cutting their hair much shorter, dating outside the home without supervision. I know that seems crazy to think about, but yes, they had to have supervision. Expectations of marriage were much higher. So there's still this idea that women should be married and should not be single. And you're going to see, because of this, the divorce rate is also going to begin to grow to where in 1900, 1 in 12 women were getting a divorce versus in 1916, 1 in 9. That means for every 9 marriages, 1 got divorced versus, 16 years earlier, every 12 marriages, 1 got divorced. So if you do the math there, you can see that progressively women are starting to change their views and what they can and can't do in society. There's also campaigns for birth control to protect women and to protect their bodies from pregnancy. And this is produced by and supported by New York nurse Margaret Sanger, who she had worked alongside many of these things with women who struggled to have babies or whatever the issue may be. And she's going to continue to push for this idea that women should be able to protect themselves and take birth control and regulate their bodies. Or, promoting forms of birth control to just protect against unwanted pregnancies. Now, the sphere of domesticity, we talked about that all the way back in Unit 4. And Unit 4 covered the sphere of domesticity as being something that women are kind of stuck in of, like, they work in the home, they raise the kids, they're stuck in this domestic lifestyle. And it's going to remain, and all women aren't going to agree that they need to get rid of it, but they do agree that they deserve the right to vote. And that's going to be what pushes suffrage forward. Now, at the turn of the century, the movement was getting old, and the Seneca Falls Convention peeps that we talked about back all the way in Unit 4 as well, they've died, they've moved on. The movement's been split since about 1869 over the fact that they can't really gain or figure out what type of approach to take. Then we come to 1890 where NALSA has come back together. And by 1890, many women had won many rights. We had Bradwell versus Illinois, in which a woman was denied her lawyer license, ends up receiving her license 17 years later. And now women can buy and sell and will property, which if you remember back in Unit 4 as well, women had no rights to buy property. If they married, they lost their land to their husband. And so suffragists are going to begin pushing different strategies forward from 1890 on. One of those being proposing a constitutional amendment, which obviously we know now is the 19th Amendment, and convincing individual states to pass this suffrage amendment. Because once it's approved in Congress, this amendment has to be approved by 2/3 Congress and 75% of the states. And so for them, they needed to push both these campaigns forward because whenever it did come up, they needed to have those people in their corner in order to win the vote. Now, it's a lot more successful at the beginning. Legislation began in 1868 and 1878, adopted by Susan B. Anthony, who goes all the way back to the Seneca Falls Convention. And she used this language that the right of citizens in the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the U.S. or by any state on the account of sex. And this quote-unquote Anthony Amendment is going to be denied every single year from 1887 on to 1896, and then it won't reappear until 1913 when the amendment gets pushed back into the forefront. Now, in the 1910s, the movement is really beginning to heat up. You have this idea becoming widely more accepted that women should have the right to vote. And you have these various women who are beginning to join the movement who are very influential. You have Carrie Chapman Catt, who is a former high school principal. She's going to be the head of NALSA for 4 years, and then again in 1915, she's going to be very influential in pushing this legislation forward. Alice Paul, who had experienced suffrage movements in London when she was studying there abroad, she's going to come in in 1913 and take over with her friend, and they're going to even organize a parade and march on Washington. And their parade was so successful in trying to push for women's suffrage that they actually ruined President Woodrow Wilson's inauguration, because when he got off the train, there was nobody there to greet him. Now, Alice Paul is going to transform all of her success into a new women's organization that's going to be separate of NALSA, and it's going to be called the Congressional Union. And it differed quite a bit. The Congressional Union was much more violent and took a different approach to how they were promoting women's rights. And many of their members ended up in jail, and then they refused to eat or force-fed because they were trying to basically punish, punish themselves, whatever you want to say. NALSA was not supportive of how the CU was approaching women's suffrage, but they weren't condemning the treatment of them in jail. Kat also is going to begin pushing forward, okay, her movement. We talked about Alice Paul's pushing forward the Congressional Union. Kat's going to start pushing back forward on NALSA. When she's given free rein to kind of do what she sees fit, she creates this idea of a winning plan, which was a large troop of people who are totally committed, who are full-time leaders, who they are pushing, these quote-unquote red-hot campaigns or these really, aggressive campaigns towards people. And by 1917, they're going to have one of the largest voluntary organizations with over 2 million people. So we come to World War I, and we'll be talking about World War I in Unit 9, but we're going to kind of skip over it onto suffrage, and then we'll come back to suffrage in just a tick in World War I. Because of World War I, women got out and became nurses and, volunteered, just like in the Civil War. Wars have helped push forward women's rights. They took up many men's jobs who were left, who had went overseas, and in the spirit of women, Congress is going to adopt an 18th Amendment creating prohibition. If you remember, if you've watched any like The Great Gatsby, those things, you've heard about Prohibition era where, made the sale and distribution of alcohol illegal. Well, that is true, and if you think about, women's suffrage has been tied to temperance, it is in honor of women. Push forward a few years later, in 1918, Congress finally formally proposes a suffrage amendment, and because of this, a ratification battle is going to ensue. So remember, I told you 2/3 vote in Congress. Well, now they've got to push for that 75% in the rest of society. And Congress was very embarrassed by the actions that came against Alice Paul and all the hard work that NALSA had done. Whenever the suffrage battle continues. And that's what happens here is that the suffrage bill is getting close to felling. States have downed the vote, and it's come down to Tennessee that they are kind of they're going to be the swing vote as to whether this bill passes, across the nation. And Harry Byrne, a Tennessee legislator who was an anti-suffragist, he was going to vote against this bill, and if he had voted against this bill, it would have downed women's suffrage and it would have ended. And he got a letter from his mom that said, "Don't forget to be a good boy and help Miss Cat put the rat in ratification." And because of this, Byrne changes his vote, votes yes, which causes the speaker to go in a riot thinking that Harry Byrne is on his side. He tries to call for a revote, and unfortunately it fails, backfires, and Tennessee votes to pass it, and the 19th Amendment is declared ratified. So make sure you answer your 3 questions for the day. Keeping up with all your notes, keeping up with your journal, all those things, and please make sure that you get your vocabulary down. If you have any questions, please let me know. If not, I'll talk to you soon.